Welcome to the Wonton Boys.
Hi everyone, welcome to episode 3 of the
Wonton Boys.
Once again, I'm Peta, and that is Edbert. Today, it's a very interesting topic because I think we're going to talk about one person and the company he started that has really influenced popular culture, both in China and in America. The guy's name is Ran Shaw.
Yeah, and so Run Shaw basically started this very influential film studio called the Shaw Brothers. And that really ushered in the golden age of Hong Kong films in the 60s and 70s. Peter, what do you know about the Shaw Brothers and how did you come across them?
So actually, Ran Shaw is like a very famous in China because like he donated a lot of buildings in universities. So I grew up in like a university in China, right? Living in like a college environment. So there was always like a Ran Shaw building. Like it's kind of like Rockefeller Center or Carnegie Hall, in like American university. So the Shaw building is everywhere. But he is also the founder of TWB, which is kind of like the equivalent of like CNBC or MSNBC. So really influential television station, which dominated the culture in mainland China because back in the 70s and 80s, there were televisions in the Canton area of China, right? But then there's no domestic television channel, or there are so few. The television would be able to get like Hong Kong broadcasts. So in China, there are different dialects, right? So the biggest one is Mandarin, and the other one's Cantonese. So TVB is like the Cantonese television channel out there.
According to my research, the studio was founded in 1958 and it closed in actually really recently in 2011. And Run Shaw actually passed away, I think about 7 years ago at the age of 107.
It's really ridiculous.
The Shaw Brothers, the movie studio was once actually the largest movie studio in the world. They had set up a studio in Clearwater Bay, which is in Hong Kong. It was locally called Movie Town. They really started becoming a major hit first with the movie called The Chinese Boxer in 1970. And then later on, more notable movies like the 36 Chambers of Shaolin. Which really influenced the Wu-Tang clan.
Especially the Wu-Tang clan, and also a lot of American kung fu flicks. But it's really unfortunate because, well, in my opinion, because like Bruce Lee has, like he was the archetypical kung fu guy, right? However, like there are so many Shaw Brother movies with like as good kind of like fighting scenes and also crazy like martial arts tropes that these films has inspired. Not only did they give a lot of samples to namely the Wu-Tang clan, but they actually gave a lot of inspiration to what they do. Well, for example, there's a member called Ghostface Killer in the Wu-Tang clan that is actually like from a movie. I can't remember as something like the Wu-Tang, like it's one of the villains in the movie.
Chow Yan Long, how are you?
Huh? Ghostface Killer! Sumay!
Yeah, and then there's also like, so like the group is based in Staten Island, so they call themselves like Shaolin. So the idea is that in the movies, like Wu-Tang is supposed to be like a martial arts school, right? And then they broke off Shaolin, so they were saying like, oh my god, like we broke off Staten Island. And then also the 36 Chamber, which is a really great movie. Like even by today's standard, it's like it's amazing. That has a lot of hip hop moves inside too.
Right. And Ghostface Killer actually came from a movie called The Mystery of Chessboxing,
which is also sampled in the Wu-Tang Clan album.
Game of chess is like a sword fight. You must think first, right?
Yeah, and also the Flying Guillotine is also a movie. The idea is that like this is Chinese weapon that basically chops people's head off, but it's on a chain, so it's kind of like it's kind of like a chain ball, right? But it's a guillotine, so it's like a flying guillotine. It's amazing, yeah.
Right, right. Master of the Flying Guillotine in 1976.
The most gruesome weapon ever conceived. See special visual effects filmed entirely in Super Cinevision as the Master of the Flying Guillotine encounters the most amazing creatures in this or any world.
Speaking about the 36 Chambers of Shaolin, in the 1970s, Kung Fu movies were kind of distributed around the world, and they would essentially film these, right, silent. They would just like dub all the sounds afterwards.
Well, and also because it's really interesting, these dubbed movies, because being produced in Hong Kong, you would think that they will be dubbed in Cantonese. However, all these original movies, they're all dubbed in Mandarin. The reason is because Hong Kong back then was a little bit backwards. So who they're selling to is that they're actually selling to Taiwan, all the movies. So that's why they dub all these movies in Mandarin. And then there are a lot of crazy like Kung Fu director and Kung Fu stars that came out of these movies, which are not really well known in the West because the West only knows about, Jackie Chan, Donnie Yen, Bruce Lee, of course. And then, but yeah, nobody know about like Gordon Liu or Lo Lei, those guys. I mean, I didn't even know about it. So as a Chinese person, because they are a thing from like a generation past. But you see the influences everywhere. I mean, one other notable Shabber mention is the one-armed swordsman. The idea of like a warrior having his arm chopped off and then he becomes stronger, becoming one-armed is also like a trope.
我只剩下一个手，我够手劲儿，不能够抵挡住对方的攻击，或是还击时不能一击致命的话，我就会伤在对方的手下。
Speaking of those early influences, when film was first introduced in like the early 1900s in China, like Kung Fu movies was one of the earliest genres in addition to wuxia. And so that really was born out of a very long, kind of longer literary tradition. And Kung Fu movies kind of was born out of these kind of common folklores.
Well, these folklores, a lot of times they will get translated into they will get translated into like comic books, like Chinese comic books, which is like the Chinese ink painting comic books. So those what came after the novels, like the written material. So Mulan is a very good example, right? Because Mulan, it was an epic, right? Well, it has nothing to do with Shaw Brother, but it was an epic. It got turned into these picture books, and in the end, becoming like a bunch of kind of kung fu movies in the end, right? And of course, the Disney animation. So it's very much the same kind of trend, I think, that has been happening. And I think it really captured people's imagination. Like Kung Fu movie influenced a lot of American action movie cinema as well. So for example, like John Wick, like a lot of the long takes in John Wick. So the idea is that like you don't cut between the like people fighting. So if you watch a lot of these old movies, all the fighting would be just done in one single take.
Yeah, definitely. Those Kung Fu movies from the 70s really influenced projects like, Kill Bill and
Matrix is clearly inspired by Kung Fu. Rush Hour, well, it has Jackie Chan in it, right? And, it has a lot of Kung Fu and it inspires like a generation of like hip hop artists, right? Like I learned it like the other day, like Kung Fu Kenny, which is Kendrick Lamar's other like alter ego. Like it came from a character in Rush Hour.
Kung Fu Kenny was the nickname of, Don Cheadle, who was one of Chris Tucker's friends in the movie, right? And then they go into his restaurant. I remember that scene, and then he, starts talking in Cantonese, which is pretty amazing.
出定睇㗎。Where's you learn that？ 程師傅教我㗎。北京嘅程師傅？唔係 ，Crenshaw 嗰個 Freddie Ching 啊。
Oh, they're brothers.
Oh, all right, all right.
One thing I wanted to touch on was lately Kung Fu movies haven't been so popular, right? Kung Fu movies kind of peaked around the early 2000s with Rush Hour 2 and Kung Fu Hustle. Peter, what do you think about why Kung Fu movies haven't been so popular? And is that related to sort of like the decline of the Hong Kong film industry?
No, I don't think it's less popular. I think it's just overtaken by Marvel, right? Because Kung Fu movie was like the superhero movie at their times. I'm quoting like YouTube at this moment, but like the Kung Fu movies was kind of revolutionary because like in all movies at the time, right, the hero was always, the guy who kicks ass is always white. And I think Kung Fu movie actually broke that archetype, like, and I think that is actually what's happening right now to a lot of Marvel movies because like that's exactly what they're doing. Even with But then there's so much kung fu that's being referenced in these movies. Like I don't even like a Chinese person don't even notice that because like for example, like Shang-Chi, right, the new
Right.
Marvel superhero. Like the 10 rings that they use actually that is a direct reference to the 36th chamber of Shaolin. You see like how deep that influence has gone, right? So I think that's the kind of short-handed answer.
I thought what was really interesting and how that related to the experience of minorities in America was how there was always this really clear story of like singular hero from like the poor family or the poor farmer or the poor village, and he would like sort of have kung fu and take on sort of the powerful, either a British villain or some sort of Western villain, or even
Mm-hmm.
earlier some sort of like a king corrupt bureaucratic official, and
Yeah,
use kung fu to sort of overcome that. And
yeah.
the way I see how that relates to hip hop is folks in New York in the 70s, they really kind of used the skills they had to express themselves in an authentic way. And Bruce Lee always really talked about that. My take on how Kung Fu movies are not as popular now is folks in Hong Kong or in Asia, we've gotten wealthy now, like countries have gotten rich. And so we it's like
Mm-hmm.
we don't really rely on those
You
narratives
don't need
anymore.
the same powerful empowerment.
And so, now you see all these sci-fi movies that have come out, big budget Hollywood, instead of going back to those roots. So,
Well, the theater model has changed. Right now, I think a lot of producer movie studios value like big budget, big action studio. I mean, big budget, big CGI action movies.
mhm,
And I think they're really losing the taste for like a really good action film because I think there is a good distinction. Definitely, after seeing so many kung fu movie, I can see a clear distinction between
mhm,
like like it's not about the scale of the action, but it's more about like rather it's real choreographed or rather it's just like full CGI because there's
mhm,
a lot of it's really hard to describe it, but if you look at those like old kung fu movies, you can see a lot of really quote unquote like hardcore actions where they really just dance like there's a dance, right? So basically they just dance for the entire movie, and that can be an art form, and I think that genre is just not as popular now. It's just like a matter of time when that is gonna come back, um,
yeah,
because it's the core of an action movie. And also, a lot of these kung fu movies are made with not like a small budget, but their
mhm.
budget is far less than what like blockbuster budgets are in Hong Kong.
When they probably started in the 70s, they had to choreograph everything. Everything had to be physical and live action just because they didn't have those big budgets. And so that's sort of why they had to really like
Yeah,
finesse the craft. And yeah, I mean definitely in the 80s, the Kung Fu mania and also the movie industry in Hong Kong kind of died down, and Run Shaw and the Shaw brothers had to sort of kind of transition into television, right? These trends kind of come and go for sure.
yeah. And I mean, his television, like TVB's television series, was also a very big in the cultural influencer in Hong Kong and in mainland China because mainland China was able to watch some of these shows. It really laid down like kind of like like the American dream for like the Hong Kong people, like what life is supposed to be and like what's good and what's bad about life. So I think that's also really interesting to discuss as well.
Yeah, for sure. And hip hop has also changed a lot as well. In the 90s, you had the sort of like gangster rap, right? You had
Yeah.
Tupac and Biggie, East Coast versus West Coast hip hop. And then hip hop became kind of globalized. And now you come to modern day and it's, very influenced by electronic music and other types of influences.
Yeah, and I mean that has a lot to be said too. However, though, still like this element of these movies are still being referenced. Like I did not know, the song Ghostface Killer is actually a song now. It's a trap song, right? I didn't know that was it's really funny because that name is almost more like people know about it because the rapper Ghostface Killer instead of the character Ghostface Killer. And that is really interesting. And it's being referred to by I think that was by Offset. It's by one of the guys from the Migos. But I think there is kind of like this tradition. Like I think that has become. I think like that is like a big part of the global culture, right? These Shaw Brother movies have really kind of added another dimension to
Right?
like action movies in general. and these action. I mean, it's a fundamental aspect of movies in the end, right? It's like movies are supposed to have great soundtrack, so movies are supposed to have great action. So I think that's kind of his influence on movies, which in turn influenced the globe in the end.
Yeah, so those movies really punched above its weight, and so it really influenced American culture, and it goes back to something, the big theme of our podcast, which is there are all these kind of cultural exchanges that happen sort of under the radar, and things kind of build up over time. So and in many ways, you could say that kung fu films influenced American hip hop and American films.
Yeah, and kung fu films really shape what I guess what kung fu is like in China, like in mainland China, because back then mainland China didn't have as strong of an identity of like this country of kung fu and like Bruce Lee. Like that was all due to like these Hong Kong movies and the notable figures such as Lo Mei, Bruce Lee, Gordon Liu, like all of these guys. Well, even though they're from the south of China, they set the foundation, they laid the foundation of like this thing called kung fu, which is what what China is very known for.
Great. Well, thanks for listening to episode 3.
Yeah, that's it. So please subscribe.
Yeah, and maybe we can revive this sort of older way of kung fu in these movies.
All right.